Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Johnny Coker. In this episode, we'll be learning about nuclear issues and the impact of the nuclear industry in New Mexico. But first, we'll be learning about renewed efforts to expand the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, also known as RECA. Joining us now is U.S. Senator for New Mexico, Ben Ray Luján. Senator, thanks so much for being here.
Well, it's good to be with you, Mr. Coker. Thank you so much for letting me visit with you.
So just to begin, can you explain what motivated you to support amendments to expand RECA?
I've been proud to be working on this important policy from the first days that I was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and have continued that effort now that I'm in the United States Senate. I'm sorry that we have to do this, but it's a necessity. So many workers that were doing work on behalf of national security efforts that worked in the uranium mines, that continued their service past 1971 are currently not protected against exposure to them. Many of them are carrying cancer or other chronic diseases based on lack of protections for them. And the original legislation provided protection for those uranium mine workers by title and by year. This package recognizes that work continued beyond 1971 through 1998. And in addition to that, there were many communities across the United States that were designated as downwind communities. What that means is that there was testing taking place downwind from nuclear sites across America, many states, including territories. The original legislation included several counties and some states, but for some unknown reason that I cannot get an answer to, New Mexico was excluded, which makes zero sense. As we all know, one of the first areas that this was tested was in New Mexico, in Tularosa. And yet that community in that county was completely excluded. Downwind communities of Los Alamos National Laboratory, downwind of Church Rock, where there was an open pit, down with Laguna and Acoma as well. So this legislation would correct those efforts. And I'm proud to be working on this with United States Senator Mike Crapo of Idaho. And he has many constituents that also need this legislation to be adopted.
And so this legislation, offers monetary compensation to downwind communities. But how else will the expansion of RECA help New Mexicans, particularly those living in rural communities?
So let's talk about the uranium mine workers. Many workers that were working side by side, some of them were included in the initial legislation based on title or the time that they were working, and others were excluded, even though they worked side by side. Some of those workers were told when their clothing would get wet working in the mines, and when it would get wet, then the yellow cake, the uranium tailings would stick to them. They were told, well, wait for your clothing to dry and then shake it off. You'll be able to clean it better. So many of those families would take that clothing home. Some of them lived in a one-room home generationally, and then they would shake it in proximity or in that home. And so they would take that with them. And so now you have grandma and grandpa, spouses, children, grandchildren maybe, that were exposed as well. This would provide more support for them. It would expand the class, the group of people that would qualify for that benefit as well. In addition to that, for downwind communities, many of those that are not included in states like Idaho or New Mexico or in other states, they would be added to this legislation as well so that they could benefit from these protections. Sure. Nothing will ever make these families whole. You can imagine the sacrifices they've gone through and the loved ones that have already passed. But this is important for the United States to accept liability and make sure that they're providing support to these families in the same way that we have in and around 9/11 with the Zadroga Act, recognizing that heroes were running into those buildings to help others, but they were exposed. the United States took action and provided support to those families. We must do the same for the families surrounding the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act and those that would qualify and benefit.
So with the expiration of RECA just 1 year away, do you feel confident that there's enough support to get compensation to those people that don't currently have it, or to get protection for them?
I'm very concerned of the sunset dates surrounding RECA. As you know, last year we were upon a deadline, and I was very worried that we in the Congress would not act timely to be able to extend the program. We were able to get votes put together close to that deadline and expanded it and extended it until 2024, June of 2024.
Okay.
Gathering votes is always a challenge, but what I have faith in is our constituents, families, reaching out to other families in other states to educate colleagues, to encourage them to be supportive of this effort as well. And many of the co-sponsors that we've seen join this cause and join this effort have come as a direct result of conversations from constituents, from families that were impacted in New Mexico, reaching out to others. And we're going to keep fighting. The more that we can educate colleagues, the more hearings that we're able to get scheduled, the more support we get. It's a fight, but I'm going to keep fighting until we can get this done.
So, as you mentioned, there is support for this bill even on a bipartisan level, but it seems as though there's also pushback for financial reasons. So, can you explain why you think that is, and what's your appeal to fellow legislators in Washington who may be on the fence?
Well, programs providing compensation and support for those that are exposed to toxic substances can be and are expensive. Similar to other programs that the United States has put forth, it costs money to provide support to those families, but it's the right thing to do. Testimony that was provided years back came from an elder from the Navajo Nation, where she shared with those of us on the dais and those that were not supportive, are you waiting for us all to die so that the problem goes away? When colleagues share with me that it's too expensive, I ask them, well, pick up the phone, go visit some of the families that are impacted and tell them that it's too expensive to help them with the cancer that they now have contracted or the chronic disease because they were sacrificing for national security efforts on behalf of the United States. It's not right. And so I understand that we have to debate every dollar that's invested, and I support that. But this is an important cause. And this, in my opinion, is a liability from the United States of America. And therefore, the United States should step forward and admit that, accept it, and do the right thing.
So in the proposed bill to amend RECA, compensation for exposed individuals would be increased to $150,000 across the board, I believe. So do you feel that that's fueling any sort of pushback? And is that something that could be negotiated in order to get the bill passed?
My colleagues have not expressed one specific area to me. What they generally will have a conversation with me about is the cost. And so, to answer the question, I imagine that anything that adds to the cost of this package would add to concern of those that are opposing the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act based on their position that it's too expensive of a package. But nonetheless, these are families, individuals that were exposed, doing the work that was required, doing the work that was necessary for national security purposes at the time, and they deserve to be compensated. They deserve to be helped. When they need help the most, that's where the government, the United States of America, our country should be, to provide them that same support that they provided to the United States of America.
So what steps is your office taking to raise awareness about the need for this legislation, both among the general public, but also the legislative community?
Myself and Senator Crapo, Senator Udall, when he was serving the United States Senate, now as ambassador, we all worked diligently to get hearings scheduled in committee. One, when Senator Udall was in the Senate, another that we were able to work with to get scheduled in the U.S. House of Representatives, meetings with the Speaker of the House of Representatives, working colleague to colleague. Teresa Ledger Fernandez the U.S. representative from the northern part of the state, or I should say a third of the state geographically. That district runs all the way down into the southeastern part of our beautiful state now. We are working to educate members, conversation, gatherings, hearings, sharing literature, whatever we can do to make sure that we get more offices on board and more members on board.
So, Senator, in my own reporting, I've talked to downwinders who have lost faith in our institutions because they feel like they've been cast aside and left behind. So what is your message to those people?
Well, their frustration is real. And I understand where they're coming from. I'm not in their shoes. And so I don't understand that pain. You asked me at the onset, one of the reasons why I was motivated to do this. As many fellow New Mexicans know, my father died from a stage 4 lung cancer diagnosis. I believe that came from exposure on the job when he was a welder and iron worker at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and the molds that he was pouring substances into, things of that nature. Well, he was not a uranium mine worker, and my father would not have qualified for the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. I saw what he and my mom went through. And there's families going through that all over New Mexico as well. So that's when I say that I understand what families are facing. It's through that lens that I understand what families are facing. I'm going to keep fighting, though. I'm going to keep fighting. I believe in these families. I believe in the cause. I believe in the greater good in people. And I know that once members of the U.S. House of Representatives and the United States Senate find out more about this and understand it, that we can earn their support. And as long as I have the honor to be here, I will keep fighting to get this done. And our colleagues that are on board with this feel the same way.
And this will be my last question. So if the efforts to amend RECA look like they won't be met, is it in the cards to try and expand the sunset date forward once again? Or is it sort of now or never, so to speak?
Well, I will use every tool at our disposal. And given that there is an extension of that date that would have ended RECA, that we were able to come together and push that date forward, it only brings more attention to the urgency of getting this done. So while my focus is on getting RECA adopted, I do not want to see RECA end. Because if RECA ends, then it puts more of a burden on these families with the challenges that they're facing. So every tool should be on the table to look at how we can get this done and how we can earn support, and willing to work together, compromise if necessary, so that families get the support that they need.
Ben Ray Luján represents New Mexico in the United States Senate. Senator, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for telling the story.
And now moving on, the Department of Energy and the National Nuclear Security Administration is working to modernize the U.S.'s nuclear arsenal by 2030. Los Alamos National Laboratory in northern New Mexico is expected to be a large part of that plan. To talk about this and other topics related to the nuclear industry, I'm joined in studio by Alicia Inez Guzmán, an investigative journalist for Searchlight New Mexico. Alicia, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
So in your writing, you said there have been 3 types of colonization that have hit New Mexico. Can you sort of explain what you mean by that?
Sure. So that really comes from the writing of Dr. Mariah Gomez, who just published a book called Nuclear Nuevo Mexico. And she talks about the 3 waves of colonization. And the first one is Spanish colonization. The second one is American. And then the third is nuclear. And the point that she makes about colonization in her book is that when it is settler colonization, that means that the settlers never leave. And so that's true of nuclear colonization, that when it arrived here 80 years ago with the Manhattan Project, it was here to stay. And so we are left to deal with nuclear colonization, and we continue to be part of that wave, is the argument.
And it seems like not only is the nuclear industry here to stay, but it is growing exponentially, sort of, with the Department of Energy modernizing the arsenal. And I know you went on a media tour at one of the plutonium facilities recently. Can you tell me more about that?
Sure, yeah. So our weapons labs are embarking on this modernization mission. And so Los Alamos National Laboratory basically was tasked to produce a quota of 30 plutonium pits annually by 2026. They're already behind, so it looks like maybe 2030 or several years after that. But plutonium pits are actually not like pits in the ground, but like peach pits. And so they're the triggers for nuclear weapons. And so Los Alamos National Laboratory is creating these pits. And so the laboratory invited several journalists to attend a tour of the plutonium processing facility, which is called PF4, in a very heavily fortified part of Los Alamos National Laboratory. So we had to don anti-contamination lab coats. We had to put booties over our shoes, tuck in our shoelaces, and then put goggles over our glasses if we wore glasses. And as we walked around, we were basically, in one of the most fortified parts of Los Alamos National Laboratory, surrounded by irradiated materials, including plutonium, for those pits.
And I know you also, in that same article where you describe this whole experience, you describe a lot of security breaches that the lab has had in the past. Can you explain, more about that? And do you feel like as more money and more development comes to the lab that these breaches will get more abundant and worse type of thing?
Sure, yeah. So one thing that I did was look at 5 years of Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board reports. And that board is a federal watchdog that has inspectors that they go into our nuclear facilities, and they'll look around, they'll make reports about what's going wrong or any safety breaches. And so what we decided to do 5 years, because that's when the modernization mission began, was in 2018. So we started with that date and went forward to see, well, what kinds of safety issues are happening at this laboratory, because we really didn't know. We hear a lot about glove box breaches, where a glove, a handler might be handling plutonium and a glove tears, and then people are exposed to plutonium. But we weren't seeing the full picture, or a fuller, I should say, picture of what was happening in the plant, as PF4 is known. And so we really wanted to understand that. And so, some of them are unexpected. We found that an instance where a worker was almost felled by a 320-pound container of nuclear waste. We found another instance where 2 electricians got locked into a security cage for 40 minutes. We found instances of glove box breaches. We found floods. There was an earthquake, which isn't necessarily like a man-made safety breach, but what we found also is that the building is not necessarily resilient enough for a large-scale earthquake. So the safety situation is really important, and I think there are concerns, especially by the safety board, that the more work you do, the faster you do it with people who are new and being trained, that's going to amplify the safety issues at the plant.
So what would your suggestion be to the higher ups who might be in charge of this type of thing to prevent this type of thing?
I don't know if I have a suggestion for them. I think that, when I've put the safety question to them several times, they'll contend that it's one of the safest places in New Mexico, if not the nation. And so that's their position at the lab, is that it is a safe place to work. I don't know if I have a suggestion, simply because I'm not a scientist and I'm not a machinist, but I've certainly talked to a lot of people, including sources, that tell me that safety culture is lacking.
And there definitely seems to be some inherent risk working around highly radioactive material.
Absolutely.
But for people that say, well, this is bringing jobs to New Mexico or bringing in, billions of federal dollars in, What would you say to that? Are the jobs worth it in your mind?
Yeah, that's a huge argument that's being made at the congressional level, is that jobs, 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 right? And New Mexico needs jobs. We're an impoverished state. And when you really look at the numbers, a lot of what you see is trickle-down economics, and it's not necessarily trickling down to everyone. So I write about this in one of the articles that we published at Searchlight about a month ago. There was a study done by UNM, and what the study showed was that that the trickle-down economics really wasn't working, that maybe we were creating kind of an economic bourgeoisie, like an upper crust in northern New Mexico, but it wasn't collectively uplifting all of our communities. And that's immediately clear when you compare Los Alamos County, which is by far one of the richest counties in America, to Rio Arriba County, which is where I'm from, and that's one of the poorest counties in the state. And so we see that a lot of our workforce comes from northern New Mexico, and the 6 surrounding counties, including Rio Arriba County, are not really benefiting on the whole.
In your research, is there any reason why that this money doesn't find its way into, some of the poorer areas of New Mexico in the north?
I think that part of it is that a lot of the money is for weapons development, and when it shakes out to jobs, a lot of the jobs are for, one of the articles that I wrote was about how the lab is partnering with local colleges, community colleges, to staff their workforce. They're calling it workforce pipelines. And those jobs are for some of the most dangerous positions at the laboratory, and it's really getting to handle the plutonium. And even though they're very dangerous, they're not extremely well paying. They're good jobs for northern New Mexico. But I think that when you kind of do the math and you see that only a fraction of our communities are actually working at the lab, the benefits aren't trickling down to a lot of other people. It really is only a fraction, I think, of people working at the lab.
And I know you spoke to some of the students in the pipeline and professors even, correct? Do they understand the inherent risk of, being those lab techs, as you said, even though they're not the best paying jobs. What sort of idea did you get from them? Do they feel that the risk is worth the reward type of thing?
Yeah, I talked to one student who said that she thought that she was being really well prepared for her position going into, TA 55, Technical Area 55, which is where the plutonium handling facility is. And, that was a question that I asked pretty much across the board to professors who were teaching these courses, to students, to lab officials. It was really a question about risk. And everybody said that the workers are being prepared, and that there is abundant protocol in place, and that there are, what they call redundancies. So you have protections in terms of physical barriers to radiation, but also in terms of more administrative protocols that are meant to protect people. And so, it is a really orchestrated place, I think. What we found with our safety reporting was that things still go wrong, and when you're in it's not like going to work like you and me, where we can just drink coffee at our desk and kind of go about our day. Everything is so highly orchestrated in this place that every time you leave the room, you have to make sure that you don't have, radiation on the bottoms of your shoes, on your hands, that, your dosimeter is facing the right direction. Everything is just so highly orchestrated that I think, risk will present itself in that kind of environment.
Los Alamos National Laboratory does a lot of nuclear weapons research, but do you think, in your mind, can nuclear research be used for good in terms of maybe nuclear power or anything like that?
Well, yeah, I think the last estimate that I saw is that between 70 and 80% of Los Alamos National Laboratory's budget is dedicated to weapons, which is very telling, right? And a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, we're working on climate change research, or we're working on vaccines, or we're working on nuclear energy. And really that is a very small fragment of the lab's overall mission. And it would be great to see the lab expand those other parts of what they're doing and, do research that is tangible. I think one of the things that when I talk to sources, building weapons doesn't benefit people, right? They're sitting in our stockpile and they're used as deterrents. But it's not like, working on a vaccine that has a tangible impact on people, right? It's, it's the threat of deterrence is what the lab and the Department of Energy and the National Nuclear Security Administration are really arguing for. So, the lab is working on technology for nuclear energy, but that's a whole other can of worms because we still have to mine the materials and we still have to put them in the ground when we have surplus or when there is waste produced.
Sure.
And those problems have not been figured out.
It seems like there's, a lot of arguments to be had around that, but unfortunately, that's all the time that we have today. Alicia Inez Guzmán is an investigative journalist for Searchlight New Mexico. Alicia, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. That's our time now. Join us on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's Morning Edition 5 to 9. Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now noon to 2. And All Things Considered 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org. And we'd like to hear from you. You can email us with a story idea and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Johnny Coker. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time on Newsmakers.